Hi, everybody. I'm Billy, the author, and this is Antioch, Chapter 18, Milk. The Grace was the only thing on the world other than water and sky. Drake was the only man on deck. He sat near the bow on a small three-legged stool, trying to milk a goat into a bucket. The ocean breeze tousled his hair, a scarf covered his mouth and nose in tattered layers, and an uncomfortable pair of goggles rested comfortably in his pocket. The goat hated Drake. His cold, clumsy hands had her ready to run. She started, but he caught her and grinned under his scarf. "Too slow, Eustace, too slow. Now hold still so I can yank on your boobs. Yank a booble dandy." Her eyes and posture couldn't have been more severe if he was threatening her with death. A man came out of the deckhouse along with the drone of a crowd until he closed the door. He approached on routine patrol, wearing the full gas mask Drake would own by the end of that day. The man shifted his rifle to one shoulder and tapped the mask's lenses with his fingers, attempting to indicate that Drake's eyes were not covered. "Wong, Magog, Gugum, Drake said. "Sorry, what was that, Fritz? Am I getting too friendly with your girlfriend over here?" "Ha ha!" Fritz chuckled in his mask, pulled it off, hump, and repeated himself. "Hey, stupid, put your goggles on." Like all of them, he had the face of youth. Drake looked around. "Why? We're in the middle of the ocean." He saluted. "I'm on a mission to milk the goat." Fritz laughed. "The rules, kid. Army Mom will be all over you if she sees. Then she'll let me have it for not doing anything about it." He heard footsteps coming from behind and turned around, still smiling. Then Fritz cried out, "Nyah!" He dropped his mask and fumbled for his rifle, choking a round into the air with a loud crack. Eustace sprang away, sailing over the railing like it was a fence in a pasture. Milk erupted from the bucket. Drake fell backward off his stool, shocked by the chaos and by the goat going overboard. Fritz fell next to him, struggling and shouting, "Kid, get it off of me! Get it off!" It looked like a woman had tackled Fritz to the deck. Her mouth was clamped into his arm. Drake froze, staring at her black eyes, recognizing her by the hair. Mullins. He'd spoken with her not long ago, after noticing her cough. Mullins had said, "Don't worry, it's not the rot. It's just a cold or something. I'll sleep it off, and we won't need all the rigmarole, okay?" Drake didn't tell anyone. Andolin's boots came thumping toward them. "Hold your breath! Hold your breath!" At point blank, her pistol clapped. Ink exploded across the deck. She put a heel in the Balron's ribs and kick-shoved it away from Fritz. Her jaw clenched when she saw him unmasked. Her stare fell on his bloodied arm. The shot was ringing in his ears when Fritz looked up at Andolin's face, the goggles and surgeon's cover, the face of death. He covered his wound and started scrambling away from her. "Oh, no, come on, you gotta be kidding me!" Feeling nothing under her expressionless plastic and glass, she shot him in the head without pause. Everything ended in an instant. The gathering crew moaned. "Oh no, not again." "That woman's done it again." "Who was it this time?" Drake was still frozen, sitting in a puddle of goat milk, unsure any of it had really happened. His eyes began to burn, and he rubbed them with wet fingers. Then he noticed that Mullen's smoke was blowing out to sea across him, and that Andolin was looking at him. Drake scooted away and put out his hand. "No, don't!" She followed him at a stride, aiming her pistol. He had his head in his arms and pleaded, "Wait! I'll clean up the thing!" She hesitated. "I can do it! I swear I'll do it, please!" They had lost a good man during a disinfection before. The idea was repulsive to Andolin, waiting to kill him while he swabbed the deck. And it would be a deviation from the system. But Drake's offer protected someone else from a deadly risk. He was not coughing. It was not in his lungs yet. They had some time. As she considered it, holding her weapon on him became increasingly difficult. She did not know his name. She recalled someone having referred to him as Goober, and then she remembered. He was young. He was not an old person in a new body like so many of the rest. He was an innocent, peeking out between his arms, waiting for her to make up her mind. He was not like Fritz. Fritz had been her friend, and she had killed him. Andolin's will broke. She holstered the revolver and said, "That is commendable." Then she turned away from him to organize the unhappy crew, calling for bleach and quarantine on Mullen's quarters. While they locked down the deck, according to protocol, Andolin imagined that everyone would follow Drake's example from then on, to bargain for a few more minutes. What would she do about that? What could she do? They had to be as ruthless as the Balron to survive. Drake got to his feet, shaking. He couldn't look at Andolin. She had a bullet waiting for him. The thought of it haunted him as he got on the good side of the wind from Mullen's body. He held his breath out of habit and dragged the smoking corpse to a circular iron hatch in the floor to the port side. The hatch opened with a wheel that screeched in its rust, uncovering a steep chute that slid straight down through the hull and out to the ship's incinerator, the coffin. Captain's design connected it to the Grace with chains and tubing, but also held it at a flexible distance. Drake let go of Mullins and watched her disappear into the chute, never to return. He saw his own mortality in that dark passage and whispered, "That's where I'm going. I'm going down the hole." He noticed Andelin dragging Fritz over, grunting and straining from the weight of the body. Drake wasn't about to help her. He left the hatch open, went to the guardrail, and looked out over the wide ocean, contemplating jumping overboard. There was no land in sight. Even if he somehow made it to shore somewhere, there would be nothing but monsters waiting for him. He wouldn't make it anyway. He'd be dead before long, regardless of Andelin's pistols. If he jumped overboard, he'd only bob along in the water behind them, blowing smoke into their wind. It was hopeless. He bowed his head and wept. Fritz slid down the chute. Andelin sealed the hatch and called for the coffin's ignition. "Two down! Light it!" The incinerator's fuel lines gurgled and clanked like plumbing. The familiar roar of the blast nozzles sounded over the water, below the level of the deck. Andelin was breathing heavily when she came to stand next to Drake. She told a solemn lie. "Your bravery is inspiring." He sniffled and wiped his nose in his scarf. "Yeah, I'm a real hero." She felt badly for the boy and tried to comfort him with familiarity. "I am sorry about this, Goober." He reeled, anguished to hear he would be remembered as Goober, and could hardly reply through his sobbing. "My name is Drake." She corrected herself. "I apologize, Drake." Then she let him shudder and sniff for a moment, while she remembered what the smoke felt like, that invasive, rapacious burning. She understood at least some of what he was going through. "Your pain is severe?" Why is she talking to me? He shook his head. "It's not that. It's that I'm dead. I can't believe it. How could this happen to me? I was sure I was going to make it." Andelin leaned on the railing, looking out at the ocean with him. "There is little hope of that for any of us. This miserable ship is a prison. We are all sentenced to death." He hadn't expected her to say that, or anything at all, really. Normally she just walked up, put her gun against someone's head, and pulled the trigger. She was merciless. She'd been getting faster, too. The first one had been a woman named Sue. Drake had nightmares about it. Andelin missing the mark with those brutal revolvers, butchering that screaming woman. Each execution after that had been quicker, up to Fritz, who'd barely had a chance to beg. Drake slumped. Why bother then? Why not just let it happen? Saying it made him think. Before Mullins, he hadn't seen one of those monsters in weeks. He'd been laughing and joking with Fritz only a few minutes ago. He didn't know if any of that mattered. Andelin said, "Because it is better to die fighting." Then she spoke her mind out of frustration. This incident could have been prevented. Mullins deviated from the system. Had she come forward and informed someone of her infection, Fritz would be alive, and we would not be having this conversation. Drake decided against saying what he knew about Mullins. He didn't think things could get any worse for him, but it seemed like a dumb confession to make. Maybe she caught it in her sleep and never got the chance. Andelin knew better than that. "Could you sleep through the pain you are currently experiencing?" Not actually being in any physical pain, he shrugged. Andelin continued. "Our casualties will increase according to the distance we stray from the system. Bowron at least are predictable. We, unfortunately, are not. Now there is no knowing where Mullins' smoke has settled. More of us may be infected as a result of her error." Drake couldn't stand the guilt, so he tried to put it on her. "Are you just going to shoot me when I'm mopping, or wait until after?" His sniffling softened the question's aggression, but the blame was still there. She did not respond. Before becoming a plague ship's executioner, Andelin had been a lawyer and a politician. She had a modified notion of guilt. It suddenly occurred to her that she tended to assume rather reviled responsibilities in society. A tiny laugh died in her chest before it could get out. Drake waited through her silence and then said, "Why don't you ever let anybody say goodbye?" Grieving lovers and friends of the dead always attacked her with that question. She had once replied that unless someone else was willing to pull the trigger, they should all be silent and stand aside. But this time was different. She wanted to talk for a little while. She said, "There is not a good way to do it other than quickly. We do not know how long it takes for the infection to begin producing smoke. That must be avoided at all costs. Immediate disposal must be our only consideration within the time we are allowed. Of course, I am saying this while deviating from the system myself." At least he is not coughing. The rail dug into her arm. Andelin shifted for comfort, and Drake tensed. He thought she had talked herself out of allowing him to clean the deck, and that she was reaching for her pistol. He didn't know she was procrastinating. that she needed a few more minutes as well. He trembled, expecting her to draw and fire at any moment. I don't think I have the rot. I got better. I saw you rubbing your eyes in the smoke. No one gets better. I do not blame you. Most of us would say anything for a little more time. My eyes aren't burning. Drake's eyes were swollen and red and filled with tears, but he hadn't been rubbing them. Andolyn studied him. It should have been difficult for him to keep his hands away from his eyes. She had ground her palms into her sockets when it had happened to her. It was curious. She pushed away from the rail. Drake cringed. His only hope then was that the bullet wouldn't hurt. She said, I will return momentarily to assist you with the disinfection, and started walking away to the deckhouse. Put your goggles on. Drake almost asked why. They wouldn't help if he already had the rod. Then he shoved his hand into his pocket for those uncomfortable goggles like his life suddenly depended on them. The deckhouse was a low rectangular room, 50 feet deep and 30 feet wide, contoured by small porthole windows and built around the center mast like a treehouse on the ground. Every one of the 75 sailors inside was wearing a mask. They watched through the windows as Andolyn talked to Drake. They surrounded her when she entered. Biggs was worried. What's going on with the kid? He'd sent Drake to do the milking. Andolyn said, He may be infected. It is strange, though. Bo pushed toward her in an intimidating respirator, a modified goalie's mask. What do you mean, he may be infected? I thought you knew if someone was infected or not. How can you wait for that jerk kid when you didn't wait for my Sue? Andolyn backed away from him. She touched her pistol, but then took her hand away, not wanting to draw it in the crowded deckhouse. With her back against the wall, she braced herself. Bo was about to give her a beating. She was not going to ask for mercy, partially desiring the freedom that came from punishment. Ditch darted in between them before that happened. He put a stiff palm in Bo's chest and said, Hey, cool off, man. I'm gonna mess you up. Bo, a foot and a half taller and much thicker, said, You bald little bastard, get out of my way. He grabbed Ditch by the jacket to throw him aside. It was as though he'd pushed the button on a machine. Ditch's hips twisted and he fired a hard knee from the torque into the larger man's groin. That would have been enough to put Bo on the floor. Ditch held him up and hit him with two more, just to make sure. Bo dropped into groaning spasms. You little... I hate you! He tried to fight his body's response to the strikes, tried to get to his feet. Then he threw up in his mask. Ditch stood over him, ready to hit him again. Man, every day with you, I'm sick of this. We all lost people. This is what we got now. I don't want to say, get over it or whatever, but come on, get over it. Everyone stood back and kept their opinions to themselves. Ditch made it clear early on that anyone who started a fight on the boat was starting a fight with him. He'd kicked more than one groin, had broken a man's fingers, and once poked a guy in the eye during a nasty scuffle in a cabin. They'd all become wary of his dirty justice. When it was clear Bo couldn't get up, his friends came over to help. They would take him back to one of their rooms, where they would uncover their faces and breathe, where they could curse Andolyn, Ditch, and all of the other monsters and draw comfort from one another's company. Vomit leaked out of Bo's mask as they carried him away. Andolyn composed herself and walked past Ditch to where Captain sat. Ditch straightened his jacket. You're welcome! She heard him, but didn't turn around. Outside, Drake was hard at work with a mop and a bucket of bleach. Andolyn had never given anyone a second chance before. Since he still wasn't feeling the smoke, he was starting to hope. He found Fritz's mask and picked it up, wondering what to do with it. It was a valuable piece of equipment, probably the best respirator on the ship, but it could have been contaminated. He looked around to see if anyone was watching. The grumbling huddle of Bo and friends emerged from the deckhouse, stared at Drake for a moment, and then went out of sight around the corner. Drake, when uncertain if something had been exposed to the smoke, often relied on the 2-second rule. He understood the rule didn't work, but unless staring into the chute, he rarely considered the consequences of a risk. Also, if more than 2 seconds had gone by, he would sometimes use the rule's general invalidity as an argument against it. Since the 2-second rule didn't work, it didn't matter if he broke it. He brushed Fritz's mask off with his fingers and then exchanged it for his scarf and goggles. Andolyn did not return to help. At first, she had been too busy defending herself against the crew's criticism. Bo's outburst encouraged others to scrutinize her judgment. If she'd been ready to fire on Drake, but he'd convinced her to let him live, how many others might still be alive if only they'd been more persuasive? She told and retold the facts, but had no explanation for why Drake wasn't showing signs of the rot. Then, after realizing how long she had been inside, she simply watched Drake through a porthole along with everyone else, like he was a firecracker with a lit fuse. Gerber's got Fritz's mask. I told you, he's a jackass. Unprecedented. The sun set 5 hours after the incident. Drake was fine, other than being cold, alone, and nervous in the dark. He complained at the deckhouse door. "Hey, I don't have it. Can you guys hear me? I'm clean. Let me in." The mask muffled his speech into honking gibberish. "Wong, mugga mug, gonna gung, wumma, wum gum, wug manog." They finally opened the door. Everyone backed away as he entered. Andolin pointed at the mask and said, "Take it off." He did as he was told. Thump. She prodded and opened his face with her fingers like she was judging a dog in a contest. Confounded, she said, "I do not understand this. How are you not infected?" Drake said, "I got milk in my eyes." She clipped out a "What?" I was thinking about it, and I got milk in my eyes." "Preposterous. Speak clearly." "No, I mean I was thinking about it while I was out there cleaning. I was milking the goat when it happened. When the smoke got in my eyes, I rubbed milk into them by accident." Gasps and murmurs ran to the depth of the deckhouse. Andolin drew back and turned to Captain. He was smoking his pipe again. It irritated her, but even when inebriated, which was often, Captain's education was impossibly deep. She said, "What do you think of that?" Captain said, "Well, it's interesting." Everyone quieted to listen. He nodded thoughtfully and nursed his pipe. "It is. It reminds me. I'd an acquaintance once, long ago. An onologist." He smiled inside of his wispy, egg-like cocoon, savoring the memory of a woman and her wine. Then he smacked his lips and continued. "She used milk as a fungicide, mixed it with water and brushed it on the vines to treat them for powdery mildew." Captain tapped himself on the gauze over his nose. "The smoke might be a species of mold, or its spore, to be true." Ditch said, "Holy crap! That's big, right? That's really important, isn't it?" The possibility of having discovered a cure for the rot staggered everyone, even more so because the cure was so simple. Some sailors patted Drake on the back, while others stood staring, vacantly declaring how much milk they were going to use. The whole rest of the way, I'm sitting butt naked in a bowl of it. Biggs, however, rubbed the back of his neck, thinking. He was more familiar with what little livestock they had aboard. "Problem is, only got us the one milker. Right now she's good for 6-7 pounds a day. No telling how long that'll last." His statement sobered the burgeoning enthusiasm. Still, one milker was better than nothing. Drake said, "Biggs, Eustace jumped off the boat." Biggs was slow to respond. "Aw, no. Eustace?" Then his frustration and resignation came out with a shake of his head and a gentle sigh. "Goober?" Drake put the gas mask back on to hide, while everyone else deduced the identity of Eustace. Captain said, "Have I gathered that our one milker had a band's name and that she's no longer with us?" Biggs said, "Yup." The room deflated. Ditch said, "Man, should have got us some more goats. It's too bad we didn't know, you know. It's too bad everybody didn't know." It was a cold, emptying idea that the cure had been there all along and that the world could have survived. Andolin gritted her teeth. "We need more goats." She turned to Captain. "Take us to land." Drake's discovery was forgotten in a surge of protests. Closer to shore meant closer to the smoke, and that was unacceptable. Andolin became frustrated with them, threw her arms out and shouted, "We shall find no goats at sea!" Interested, Captain began ruminating aloud. We'd lose weeks to do it, and expose ourselves even more along the way, all without knowing whether it's worth it or not, whether it really works." The room stopped bickering to listen. Noticing their attention, Captain said, "At least, I can't think of an acceptable test, that is, unless we've a volunteer to lick the chute." He looked around. There was not a volunteer for that. "No? Well, I doubt we've any milk left anyway." Andolin announced her argument like she was in a courtroom. "We are presented with risk in either scenario. Since we are dying, we must consider the amount of time involved in each of our options. How long before we can expect to reach this Moreau?" Captain said, "Months, most of a year, if Zeke's points are right, not knowing what other troubles we'll have. We're bound for uncharted waters. We've only just begun." She then charged through the more peculiar particulars. "How long before we could reach a place that might have goats, or sheep, or some other sort of lactating beast?" Captain snickered and drifted off on the effect of his pipe. His first mate was a cold-blooded killer, but she was also an invaluable member of their improvised crew. There were 100 of them left, and there'd have been less or none without her. Thanks for that, at least, Ezekiel. When he remembered he was in conversation, Captain came back in good humor. He smiled, imagining the impatient frown waiting for him under the face of death. "We've been following the continent, roughly. My guess on that, as I've said already, would be weeks. Aye, indeed, not a bad gamble, maybe." And he winked at her, though she couldn't have seen it. Andolin used his faint approval to challenge the room. "Who here is willing to come ashore with me?" There was mumbling and grumbling and some mentions of "nobody" under their breath. Not one of them considered going ashore with Andolin to be any better than licking the chute. Ditch said, "That's nuts." Andolin was about to say that if she had survived on open land for 12 days, they could do so long enough to raid an abandoned ranch for livestock. She needed to convince them it could be done. But before she'd begun, Biggs came forward and said, "Yeah, me." It surprised her. Biggs brooded lonesome days away with the ship's animals, and was not one to speak out often. She did not expect much out of him, but welcomed the support. If nothing else, he could hold the bag. She said, "Are you able to use a rifle?" He shrugged. "Some." That is the end of Chapter 18. If you enjoyed this podcast, you can follow the link at the top of my website, www.williameharlan.com, and purchase the full novel from Amazon in ebook format for $2.99 or as a paperback for $12.99. Thanks for listening. Tune in next week for Chapter 19, Michael's Wall.